Big news this week, Virgil.
Big news.
Kerfuffle on the left.
Big news. Big on the left, really? All right.
Why do you say it like that?
This really is big news then.
I mean, in our circles, it is big news for one of the biggest icons of the progressive movement.
Brianna Gray.
Absolutely not. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got a lot of heat today on Al Gore's internet. All right. So a fellow named Eric London, who writes for the World Socialist website, wrote an article about an interview that AOC gave to DSA back in January.
Okay. So the interview's not fresh.
The interview's not fresh, but the article that it's one of those, the article is the interview things, transcript of an interview.
Yeah, right.
And it just dropped this week. So the interview itself happened a long time ago, but it dropped recently. Okay. So Eric London's write-up of that interview is pretty scathing. And its main critique is that AOC has fully betrayed her progressive values and is now kind of openly shilling for the Democratic Party. So the opener is on March 19th, the Democratic Socialists of America's magazine, Democratic Left, published an interview with AOC in which the Democratic Congresswoman and DSA member combines the most lavish praise for the Democratic Party with vicious denunciations of socialism. Now, with a lead like that, I'm expecting quite a lot.
It sounds, yes, this London character, I don't know, this person sounds very critical of the matter. I will have to say that actually the fact that I didn't realize this was in the DSA newspaper, because that comes out on I want to say monthly or bi-monthly basis. So then that makes a little more sense. So it's for a website, you can just publish anything you want on the internet whenever you want.
Sure, and I don't even know that it's not the only reason I think it's really relevant that the interview itself was conducted a while ago is because AOC at a certain point argues that it's not fair to say that Joe Biden hasn't done anything relevant, that there's been no progress or that there might be no progress under Joe Biden because of what he is able to do for immigrants at the border in Dreamers, et cetera. And when she said that, it was before a lot of the subsequent disappointments about how Biden is handling our immigration crisis.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is from before the COVID bill, before the past 2 months or so. But after he was inaugurated?
Yes.
Okay.
So the left went crazy. And everyone, including a lot of people that I really respect, were like, this is the final evidence we need, the nail in the coffin, we're canceling AOC. I want to read you some more quotes from the Socialist website article to give you color as to why people are so upset. In the interview, Ocasio-Cortez presents the Democratic Party as having been completely transformed into a working class party. She says the Biden administration and incumbent Democrats are, quote, totally reinventing themselves in a far more progressive direction, end quote. Pressure from the left has forced, quote, almost a radical change, end quote, among entrenched Democratic leaders. What is needed, she says, is a turn deeper into Democratic Party electoral politics. So the idea being that AOC is saying, we just got to work within the system. Our pressure on the Democratic Party has radically shifted it to the left. We should all be really happy with what Biden is doing.
Sure.
That's the case this article is making about what AOC said in her interview.
Right. I mean, a lot of that is paraphrasing. So I'm curious what are...
Oh, it's even worse. It's worse than paraphrasing. It's some of these quotes even that are quotes are taken out of context. And we're going to get to that.
Okay.
I just want to give you color because a lot of people that I like and respect are very upset. And I think many of them might not have read AOC's original interview, some of which I have a problem with, some of which has been mischaracterized in
absolutely.
This World Socialist article. And so I want to validate why people would be upset and they popped off online based on this, because this is rather incendiary, the World Socialist website article. And so, I mean, I'm not saying you're off the hook for not having read the original, but I get where the ire is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I only don't read the original because I know you're going to talk about it, and I like reacting to things. I'm serious. I mean, if you in the future you want me to just read all this stuff in advance, I can do that. But I find the reaction to be an interesting part of the show.
Well, you know, what's funny about that, if I can digress just briefly, is that whenever we do like a Virgil explains to Brianna, no one seems to have a problem with that. But even though the last episode was largely Virgil explains to Brianna, several of the comments in the comment section were all about how I henpecked you over your Visco girl turn.
What?
I apparently
Henpecked.
I just completely dominate and emasculate and henpeck and attack poor
that's
Virgil.
The language they used? Henpeck?
I don't know. I might be editorializing a little bit there.
Yeah, you might be doing, I mean, are you writing your own World Socialist website article about the comments we get? Well, anyone who's saying crap like that, knock it off.
It's fine. I have a thick skin. Okay. So, I'm just going to read a couple more from this, and then we're going to move on to the analysis, okay? One of the big criticisms that Eric London offers is that AOC basically throws democratic socialists under the bus as potentially race essentialists, okay? So what AOC says in the article is she's asked, some on the left have looked at Biden's record and his difference with the Bernie wing of the party, and they conclude that no progress is going to come out of the Biden administration. What is your view? She answers, well, I think it's a really privileged critique. We're going to have to focus on solidarity with one another, developing our senses for good faith critique and bad faith critique. Shout out. Because bad faith critique can destroy everything that we have built so swiftly. And we know this because it has in the past, and it's taken us so many decades to get to this point. We do not have time or the luxury to entertain bad faith actors in our movement.
Okay, wait, but she's not talking about us.
Well, I think a good question to ask is, who is she talking about when she says we don't have the luxury to entertain bad faith actors in our movement? Because it's a pretty strong statement, like excommunicate somebody.
Well, yeah, I mean, that can mean a lot of things. Like, you could mean, saboteurs, wreckers, anything from that to people who get mad at me on the internet. Like, that's, I mean, like everyone who criticizes me on the internet, like they're acting in bad faith and we need to excommunicate them. We got to get rid of them. They're wreckers. And, like, I agree with that point, but only as applied to me. I don't think anyone else should make that judgment.
We got you. I mean, the main issue, I think, with that, I mean, I understand why people are upset with that, right? Because she's using that kind of privileged language to say, frankly, it's the same argument that was leveraged in support of Vote Blue no matter who, yada, yada, yada.
Sure, yeah.
If we don't do what we can, this is the same argument Chomsky made. Like, if you don't do harm reduction, then it's privilege because there's someone who would have been harmed, someone who would have been harmed if we didn't do harm reduction, right? Who's going to be able to blame you for what happens to them. And there's always going to be someone, no matter how incremental the progress, no matter how small, you're always going to be able to use the argument that if we hadn't compromised, if we hadn't taken what we could get, then someone was going to get hurt. And then to frame that as you must not really care about marginalized communities because you want us to go for the big thing like a $15 minimum wage instead of the short-term thing like child credits, which are great, but which will expire, then you are just acting out of privilege. That's why people are upset, and I think that that's legitimate.
What was just read, it's skirting a little close to, well, if you criticize Biden, you're privileged.
Yes. Now, part of the issue is that the question is just bad, right? Very few leftists are saying no progress whatsoever will come out of a Biden administration. Like, he's just going to sit there like a lump and not legislate, not do anything at all, like not even keep the wheels of the country turning. I mean, it's hard not to push back against that in some way when you're answering a loaded question, like, especially if you're part of the system, you're going to be defensive about a statement that,
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So I wish you would have characterized it differently. I wish you would have rejected the premise and said, well, I don't think very many people on the left are arguing that absolutely nothing will come out of the Democratic Party. What they're arguing is that the Democratic Party has in its power to do a lot more, given that we have the House and both branches of Congress, and that I don't want the incremental advancements, some of them meaningful advancements that the Biden administration is taking on, to be used as an excuse to cover up for the fact that they know they could be doing more and are choosing not to.
Yeah, what's the rest of that answer?
But we also have to value our solidarity with one another. For anyone who brings that up, we really have to ask ourselves, what is the message that you are sending to your Black and brown and undocumented members of your community, to your friends, when you say nothing has changed? Perhaps not enough has changed. And this is not a semantic argument. Just the other night, we, in collective struggle, were able to stop the deportations of critical members of our community, and that would not have happened in a Trump administration. So she doubles down on the Black and brown and undocumented, and she acknowledges that, not enough has changed. Like, she acknowledges the point about, sure, you can argue that not enough has changed, but doesn't actually engage on. Of course, the interviewer doesn't ask her, well, what are you doing to make sure that we do enough, that the Biden administration is pushed to do all that it could do? Yeah,
right.
And so it does feel that is one of the sections that I think there's legitimate critique about, and that I had some of the biggest problems with.
Or that it does it without needing to be pushed, because that's the priority and moral center of the administration that we just elected.
Right. Okay, so here's the part about class essentialism that people were really, really upset about. This is again from the Worldwide Socialist piece. Ocasio-Cortez saves the most vituperative comments for the genuine socialist opponents of Biden. When asked, what was your path to joining DSA, Ocasio-Cortez responds by repeatedly stressing what makes DSA, quote, distinctive from other socialist groups. Quote, we felt like there wasn't this class essentialism, but that this really was a multiracial class struggle that didn't prioritize human rights. Frankly, I was really impressed. Now, people lost their ish because they felt like she was really leaning into the idea that liberals put out there, which is that the left is class essentialist, doesn't care about race, and that's a fair characterization of what's motivating the left. Now, I'm going to read that in context because I think that this is the most bad faith part of Eric London's article. Okay. This was wildly out of context. So I will caveat this by saying I have interviewed AOC for over an hour about this idea that the left gets accused of this. Okay. 2 years ago at South by, in fact, the photograph at the top of this article is from her interview with me. That look she's giving, askance in the photograph, is a look that's coming into my direction. In context, it becomes clear that what she's saying is she has been engaged in her heavily Hispanic working class community, doing all kinds of political works, and that she was skeptical of any number of organizations that seemed to be predominantly white and not interested in doing praxis, actually getting involved with communities and working on the ground. And that what she saw from DSA was that they actually were involved and were getting people like Jabari Brisport, who's been on the show, elected and working with Black and brown communities. So did you want to say something?
Yeah, it sounds like how this is being read is, they had socialism signups, and she looked at all the socialist organizations and picked the DSA because it seemed the least racist. I'm just curious, are people specifically reading this as an attack on their own personal socialist organization?
Not really. From what I've seen, it's not like the people who are objecting are DSA per se. In fact, a lot of them are more radical folks who have been critical of the DSA and of their approach through all of this stuff, whether it's the $15 minimum wage, enforce the vote, and all of this. And a lot of the people who are critical are Black and brown and more radical. I think the DSA folks, frankly, this is their article. They're not mad at AOC. This is a DSA article about AOC that came out, and I think that they don't have a problem with it. What AOC actually said, and I agree that the verbiage about race essentialism wasn't necessary and is a nod to stereotypes that aren't particularly helpful. But what she actually said was, that she grew up in a working class household. She wasn't a red diaper baby or anything and didn't have that kind of political background. Right. But what initially drew me to DSA was the fact that they showed up everywhere, that I showed up. I started my work as a community organizer before I even knew about the existence of DSA. And I was busy doing work in my community, working with children, working with families, advocating for educational equity. A friend of mine invited me to a DSA meeting in the Bronx/Upper Manhattan branch. We were in the basement of a church uptown in Washington Heights, I believe. It was my first time being exposed to DSA. And to me, it was like, okay, we're hearing all this rhetoric and having discussions. And I'm like, okay, another group of folks talking. This is great. This is encouraging. This was around the time that when DSA was picketing one of the major camera companies in New York City, trying to call attention to the warehouse workers.
B&H.
Mm-hmm. And they brought undocumented warehouse workers to the meeting and translated their testimony. And on top of that, the chapter had free childcare provided to anyone who wanted to show up. And that, to me, at the end of the meeting, I was like, okay, this is real. You know, there's a lot of people who talk about class issues. There's a lot of people who are deep in the discourse of struggle. But to me, as someone who grew up in these environments, it was the translation to action that was distinctive to me. She's happy that they did praxis. That is what made DSA initially distinctive to me. And it made it something that was flagged to me as worthy of continued attention. And then Jabari Brisport ran for city council. It felt like something fundamentally different to me, even in the context of electoralism. And then she talks about how she was dubious of electoralism before that. And here we go. Here's how I know, like, even though I agree that the verbiage around race essentialism is not helpful, that she knows better. Because she says this about her skepticism of electoralism. I felt that way because I grew up around Bronx machine politics, where there was a lot of cynical use and weaponization of identity under the guise of lobbyist-driven policies and corporate policies. I had essentially given up on it, and I felt the only way we were going to do this is by committing ourselves to the communities. She goes on to talk about how there's been historical tension between the DSA and organizing collectives of color. Whether it was Latino and Puerto Rican collectives, Chicano collectives, Black collectives, it was like, okay, it's these white folks, and laughs. There was this historical fissure, but it really felt like a moment where we were coming together. And so when I would see DSA showing up, providing real structural support at BLM rallies or support for abolishing ICE, where we felt like there wasn't this class essentialism, but that there was really a multicultural class struggle that didn't deprioritize human rights, frankly, I was really impressed, and it felt like it was something worth being part of. It's harder to be mad at it in context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing that I could really surmise that I mean, just so far, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's more fucked up stuff to come, but that people would be upset about is the insinuation that there are, race blind, class only organizers, socialist organizations that are, not doing the work that she, just talked about, which, I mean, I don't know. I feel like a lot of people on the left who might be skeptical of the DSA or opposed to the DSA would take that as a slight, would be like, oh, they're talking about me.
Sure. And it's hard because I don't think that anyone would really argue that there haven't been issues relating to diversity and inclusion, for lack of a better word, in the DSA. And the whiteness of the membership is an ongoing discussion, in that it doesn't always reflect the economic, the class or racial diversity of the communities it's trying to organize.
Oh, sure.
And that's a separate conversation for whether or not the ideology of the people in those groups is race blind. But certainly, I think it would be fair for an AOC who is not a member or familiar with the DSA to be skeptical of a predominantly white organization that has had historical tensions with more diverse local groups in these communities before getting involved. And what she's saying, whether or not you agree, is that when she got to know the DSA better, she was disavowed of the idea that they weren't willing to put boots on the ground and engage with communities that didn't reflect the demographics of the DSA, which I think is ultimately complimentary. Now, the question about whether or not that's supposed to be like a shady indictment of other kinds of lefty orgs, I don't know that you can read into it that much. I think she's giving an interview to a DSA magazine.
Sure.
And so she's blowing up the DSA. She's a DSA member.
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone could like make a credible argument that something like Socialist Alternative was whiter or less engaged in the community than DSA. So I'm inclined not to read it that way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just reading too much in the way that she phrased some of these things. Because otherwise, like, this is just a pretty straightforward testimony that paints the DSA in very good light.
Yeah, it's the sentence that gets her in trouble is, where we felt like there wasn't this class essentialism. I would see DSA showing up, providing real structural support at all these POC rallies and stuff, where we felt like there wasn't this class essentialism. So it does feel like in that moment, she's buying into the narrative that not just that the DSA would maybe not be so engaged in community work, but that they weren't engaged because they didn't believe it was important or necessary to have a racial framework in their ideology. And so she's conflating maybe an ideological critique that she doesn't intend to make, I'm trying to give her the best faith reading here, with a critique about praxis, which she is intending to make and which she found herself disavowed of once she joined the DSA. And that's messy, and maybe she should clean that up. But that's not the same as what people are saying on the internet right now.
Well, yeah, I imagine this is being read as proof positive that she's she's doing identity politics,
right,
and destroying class politics,
right.
And there you have it. I mean, I get why people are reading it that way, but it's also like, so what are you saying? The DSA should like tell Black Lives Matter to fuck off? Well,
right. Well, they're reading it that way because. And this is not even their fault. It's because Eric London very much frames it that way. If you read Eric London straight, he's saying, AOC saying that anyone who's opposed to the Biden administration doesn't care about Black people. A very Joe Biden thing to say. Eric London makes some fair points, and there are some fair criticisms of AOC, and I'm going to get to them. I just want to clear all of the bad faith stuff out of the way, because I think that the good faith criticisms will land better when we get this junk out of the way. One of the other criticisms, and this is the one that we've wrestled with a lot on the show, is that AOC seems to have bought in wholesale to the idea of electoralism as the answer to our problems, which I don't think is entirely fair, because she does say there's a lot of work that we can do outside of electoralism, but there is critical electoral work to be done as well. And obviously, she's a legislator now. She's going to focus on that. I understand that orientation. She does nod to the need for an outside strategy. But I think what is more damning about the interview, what is, I think, a more legitimate criticism, is that she doesn't take any space in this interview to talk about what that outside strategy looks like. And she says that before she joined Congress, she only had one tool at her disposal. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail or whatever. And that the sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, like those kind of adversarial techniques were what she had, so she used them. But now, because of COVID, it's more difficult to do things like that. And also because she's on the inside, she sees all the things that she can do in the legislative process. And she gives us an example, a bill that they got copy of like the night before they needed to vote on it. It was huge, and there was no way that they could actually have read it, but they did like a control find and found a bunch of like weird bad money going to, I think, like dirty energy company or something. And they were able to pull it because no one would fess up to having actually put it in there. So she's like, this is an example of the kind of things that we can do being on the inside, which is fine, fair enough. But that's not really the critique that the left is making right now of AOC in the context of force the vote and a $15 minimum wage. The critique is that you could still be doing a lot more, both from the inside and leveraging the support that you have on the outside to pushing for things that are a lot bigger than like picking fat out of a bill. She talks about the Green New Deal and Medicare for All as examples of policies that are very popular, but she says people overstate basically their popularity and undersell the extent to which we need to keep organizing, et cetera, because lobbying efforts against those policies can really change public opinion, which is obviously true. But this is like kind of put out there by her as a rationale for why we need to just keep electing people and like convincing people without really doing the same thing that Ro Khanna was doing, right? Where you don't really state what the end date is for when we're going to get the polls to a point where we're willing to force politicians to act on the results of those polls. Yeah. So the question is, DSA's priorities really are your priorities as well. Green New Deal and Medicare for All in particular. There's no getting around the fact that each of those are going to require an act of Congress. What is the most strategic thing that DSA members and chapters could be doing right now to bring that about? AOC says, I'm a big believer in exercising a dual approach. First of all, I think you're right. There's no Medicare for All without an act of Congress. The thing is legislation after all. Here's where she's kind of shading. I think sometimes people fall into this trap of wishful thinking about a poll question, thinking that support is solid and that it is unsusceptible to the propaganda of corporate lobbyists in the health insurance industry. I think the first thing we need is real honesty about the work to be done ahead of us. So again, there's this idea that anybody who wants her to do more is naive, that they think that she can snap her face. I don't think that anyone would deny that it's going to be hard and that organizing is required. And that's not the issue. Okay, we need real honesty about the work ahead of us. There are some issues that poll really well and the polling is concrete. There are other issues that poll one way or another and the polling can really fluctuate with just one ad campaign. Now, I want everyone to keep in mind that the polling on Medicare for All has been in one direction. And even though Bernie hasn't been on the campaign trail talking about it over the past year, there was a recent report that showed the polling just went up on Medicare for All. It just went up. AOC. Actually, we experienced this in a positive way with the Green New Deal, in that the oil and gas lobbies have gone in so hard to try to give the Green New Deal a bad name. And even after total hammering that it experienced by the Republican Party, it still doesn't poll that poorly. Okay, feels like a little bit of a counterfactual. You're saying that the Green New Deal has sticky support, it's solid, it's good. So that's not really an area where we need, it's not that we don't need organizing, but organizing isn't the obstacle to Congress members getting behind it. Convincing constituents is not the argument, is not the obstacle to getting their representatives behind it, right? However, one thing that we do see is that even in areas where it might not poll as well as we would like, what we find is that it's highly susceptible to positive messaging. Once we go in and either send organizers or have other forms of messaging and actually explain what the Green New Deal is, polling skyrockets. Wonderful. And so in terms of tactics and what's needed, I think we actually need to make the case for single-payer healthcare that is free of cost at the point of service. Do you see that pivot? The Green New Deal is great. It's susceptible to positive messaging. It hasn't been that susceptible to negative messaging. So what we really need to do to get Medicare for All is to make the case harder for Medicare for All. I don't understand what that is. And we have to, this is AOC again, and we have to say what we mean by Medicare for All, because as we know, there are a lot of cynical actors to try to add all these ellipses, like Medicare for All who want it, that make less than $100,000 per year. And that's why we have to engage in the work of organizing. Do you see what I mean? It's more subtle than the things that people are mad about online, but that's the part of this that caught my attention. It's the thing where they put the specter of organizing. They frame the debate about why we don't have nice things as we haven't convinced enough people yet. And even though AOC knows perfectly well what the polls are, knows and says here in the context of this interview that despite lobbying efforts, the Green New Deal is strong and that it has a lot of potential to be even stronger because it's susceptible to positive messaging. She doesn't say anything about the polling around Medicare for All, but just pivots to, we need to message harder around Medicare for All because the Pete Buttigiegs of the world are trying to sully it with Medicare for All who want it stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like that, it completely sidesteps the question of how we're going to get Medicare for All. How we're going to legislate. She opens a section talking about how, yes, we have to legislate all of these things ultimately. She's a legislator who's in a position to point out the extent to which this is a popular program. These are popular programs that people want. And yet, instead of saying we need to call out our legislators for not listening to these polls and listening to their constituents, she says we need to organize more.
Or to restate the question, it's why is there a gap between the policy preferences of voters and the policy preferences of legislators?
Yes.
And how do we close that gap?
Correct. That is the question that does not get answered. And she, again, I want to give credit where credit's due. She says there is a lot of work that we can do outside of electoralism, but there is certain critical electoral work to be done as well. And this is the part that was quoted in the Eric London article. And so the emphasis goes back to getting people elected to Congress, getting progressives elected to Congress. I don't disagree with getting progressives elected to Congress. But if you have, I'm sorry to be so redundant, but if you have a critical mass of progressives in Congress who can do something because of narrow majorities, like hold up a must-pass bill until a $15 minimum wage is in it, or get rid of Richie Neal as the head of the Ways and Means Committee as a condition for voting for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, and you have that power with your minority and you don't use it, it starts to wear on people. It starts to make people cynical about the return on the investment of fighting so hard to get more progressives in office.
Sure, yeah.
The one last part is that, she does say it's harder to do the outside strategy because of COVID. But I do think that what she misses, and what I would love to hear her talk more about, is the opportunities, the quote, opportunities for disruption that she could facilitate, like using her incredible reach and call lists to call for protests at the Capitol, to call for protests at people's homes or offices or whatever is deemed appropriate, to apply the kind of outside pressure that used to be her emphasis by her own admission in this interview before she joined DSA.
I mean, I think there is a kind of skepticism that even a public pressure model would be insufficient to, little less a purely electoral model of organizing would be purely insufficient to actually overcome the insurance industry, to overcome the driving force of private profit and capital. That is obviously the only impediment to Medicare for all.
I think that's right. I mean, so we brought this up with Representative Khanna too. We all understand the extent to which, yes, it's the lobbying and the the campaign ads they're going to run against you and all of that. And AOC talks about that too, right? She talks about the right-wing effort to unseat her, how her race was like the most expensive, or one of the most expensive in the country for no reason other than the right hates her so much. And yes, that's part of it. But part of it is the amount of money these people take straight from these industries, which is why I'm heartened by some of this stuff. I saw National Nurses United wrote up basically their plan to get Medicare for all, and it has some good ideas, including a kind of divest from the healthcare industry campaign, where they're going to pressure, the representatives they need to flip to not take any money from these industries. Why this isn't a thing that we've done already? We've done it around fossil fuels and stuff. It's a great idea, but when I read it, I thought to myself, like, why the dickens haven't we done this already?
Well, keep in mind, it's also more than, and I think that's very worthy, but it's also more than just getting these members of Congress to, do the baseline of not being corrupt and not taking the money. Because as well, there's also a pressure to, nevertheless, even if you're not taking money from Aetna and big health insurers, there's a pressure to still not piss them off, so that they don't, end up running millions of dollars worth of ads in your district.
I think that's right, but AOC kind of made our argument in that last paragraph I read, right? Because AOC's own argument is like, yes, there's pressure from these lobbying campaigns, but despite all of that, the Green New Deal polls well still. And she didn't say it about Medicare for all, but Medicare for all polls well still. It's not like they were just like not doing anti-Medicare for all ads for the last year. I forget the stat, but I believe like 2018 or 2019, whatever the year was leading up into the election, one of those years was the most that had ever been spent on anti-universal healthcare ads. Like they geared up. These ads were out there. I mean, did you watch the debates and see those pharmaceutical ads popping up all over the place? Like, There was a full court press against Bernie and what he meant to their industry, the threat that he posed to their industry. And despite all of that, and perhaps because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, during which, yes, I guess I haven't said it in a few episodes, 15 million people at minimum lost their employer-based health care, people still ride with Medicare for all.
Yeah, and they're giving out the vaccines for free. And everyone agrees that's how it should work.
Right.
Nobody's stepping in and saying, wait. Why aren't the health insurance companies making a profit here? Why is this going on uninsured people?
I mean, the health insurance companies 100% are making a profit off of this. It's not actually, I mean, there's a whole other conversation we should have about how these things are getting paid for and how much this is just all of it, like the Cobra stuff, is just a payout to these industries. And there are cheaper ways that we could be doing all of this. But that's another episode.